The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the banquet hall, a sound that should have signaled joy and anticipation. Laughter, polite chatter, and the faint strains of a string quartet swirled together under the golden chandeliers. The rehearsal dinner for my daughter's wedding was meant to be a warm prelude to her big day. Instead, it became the night my world shattered. I stood at the far end of the table, quietly sipping sparkling water, doing what I'd done my entire life, watching, listening, making sure everyone else was comfortable. The waiters moved smoothly around the room, topping off wine glasses and balancing trays of appetizers. Rebecca, my daughter, sat at the head of the table beside her fiancé, Michael. Her cheeks glowed, her eyes sparkled. She looked every bit the bride-to-be she had dreamed of becoming. For a moment, pride swelled in my chest. I thought, maybe all the sacrifices were worth it. But then Rebecca rose from her seat. Forks paused mid-air. The string quartet faltered into silence. Everyone's eyes turned to her, expecting the usual speech of gratitude brides give on the eve of their wedding. She clinked her glass gently, smiled, and said in a voice both sweet and icy, "Mom, you're no longer part of my family." The words sliced through the room like a blade. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. 100 eyes swung toward me, some confused, some gleeful, others pitying. I froze, the stem of my glass trembling between my fingers. My daughter's declaration wasn't whispered in anger, wasn't muttered in private. It was staged, calculated, performed in front of every relative, every friend, every colleague who mattered. My son Ethan smirked from across the table, his arm draped possessively around his wife Diana, who leaned in and whispered something that made him chuckle. My ex-husband Richard adjusted his cufflinks, his face unreadable, as if this public humiliation were just another business transaction. And Rebecca? She looked at me with the cool detachment of a stranger, her words lingering in the air like poison. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. How could I? What defense exists when your own child erases you in front of the world? My throat tightened, heat rising up my neck. I searched for kindness in the faces around me, but all I saw were whispers forming, heads tilting, guests shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. My entire life flashed before me, the double shifts I had taken as a nurse so my kids could have dance lessons and sports camps, the nights I stayed awake sewing costumes, the years I went without vacations to pay their tuition. I remembered Rebecca's first ballet recital, how I stood in the back row of the auditorium with tears in my eyes as she twirled on stage. I remembered holding her during storms when she was small, whispering that nothing would ever tear us apart. And now, here she was, delivering the final blow before her new family-to-be. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my hands steady on the tablecloth, but inside 1,000 questions screamed, why would she do this? Who whispered in her ear? Why tonight, of all nights, with strangers watching? Rebecca's voice rang out again, sealing my exile. I want to begin my marriage free of the past, free of drama. Tonight, I draw the line. She raised her glass as though it were a toast. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. The room erupted into a nervous mixture of applause and whispers, the polite mask of society barely concealing the shock. Some clapped hesitantly, others avoided my eyes altogether. I sat frozen, heart hammering, ears ringing with humiliation. And in that moment, I felt something crack inside me. Not a simple break, but a deep, thunderous fissure that split decades of sacrifice from the brutal truth. My family had turned me into the villain of their story. I looked at Rebecca, my daughter, my flesh and blood smiling as if she had triumphed. I glanced at Ethan, smirking with his wife, both of them reveling in my disgrace. And Richard, calm, calculating, complicit. Why? The question roared inside me, unanswered, unbearable. But as I stared across the glittering table, one truth ignited like a spark. They thought they had ended me tonight. What they didn't know was that tomorrow, in front of even more witnesses, I would have my chance. And when I did, they would be the ones trembling. My name is Helen Carter, and for 50 years I thought I understood what family meant. I grew up believing that if you worked hard, sacrificed enough, and loved unconditionally, your children would remember. They would stand by you when the years carved lines into your face, when your hands grew tired, when you had nothing left to give but your presence. I believed loyalty ran in blood. I was wrong. I spent 30 years as a nurse, working long shifts in crowded hospitals where alarms never stopped beeping and the line between life and death was often measured in seconds. I gave everything to my patients, but even more to my family. I would finish a double shift, stumble into my car with aching legs, and still drive across town to make it to Rebecca's recitals or Ethan's baseball games. Sometimes I was the mother in scrubs at the school auditorium, smelling faintly of antiseptic, clapping louder than anyone else because my children were all that mattered. When Richard and I divorced, people whispered. They said marriages don't last anymore, that maybe I should have chosen better, loved smarter. But I stayed silent. I didn't tell anyone about the affairs, the lies, the way Richard always valued appearances more than people. I let him keep his image. I kept the scars. My children became my anchor. I swore they wouldn't suffer, not if I could help it. Ethan was always the bold one, loud, confident, the kind of boy who thought the world owed him space. Rebecca was quieter, more delicate. She clung to me when storms rattled the windows, when nightmares woke her in the dark. She was my shadow, my little girl who once told me, "Mom, when I get married, you'll stand next to me no matter what." That promise echoed in my head at the rehearsal dinner, mocking me. After the divorce, I carried both financial and emotional weight. Richard offered child support but used it as leverage, a way to remind me that without him, I would drown. So I worked more hours. I skipped vacations, skipped luxuries, skipped the new clothes and jewelry my coworkers bought. My money went to college funds, braces, piano lessons, and the endless stream of expenses that come with raising children in a world where fitting in costs more than love. I thought Rebecca noticed. I thought Ethan did too. But the years blurred, and something shifted. Ethan grew distant, then resentful, especially when I couldn't buy him the newest car or gadget. Richard swooped in, gifting Ethan expensive things and earning his loyalty, while I was left the role of nagging mother who said no too often. Rebecca stayed close at least. That's what I believed. She called me after late-night study sessions, cried on my shoulder when breakups broke her heart. She told me I was her role model, the one who taught her how to stand tall. I never imagined she would one day stand taller by pushing me down. And Diana, my daughter-in-law, oh, how easily she slipped poison into every crack. She married Ethan with a smile that could charm anyone, but beneath that smile was calculation. She nudged him against me, whispered about how controlling I was, how old-fashioned my expectations seemed. I caught the way she looked at me, like I was a burden to be managed, rather than a woman who had given them everything. Still, I pressed on. When Rebecca announced her engagement, I was the first to cheer. I offered to help with expenses, dipping into the retirement savings I had carefully built. Just a little cushion, I told myself. So my daughter has the wedding she deserves. A cushion turned into checks, checks turned into wire transfers, and before I knew it, I had contributed more than I ever planned, over $200,000. Every dollar was a silent prayer that this day would be the beginning of her joy. Instead, my reward was public exile. As I stood in that banquet hall, humiliated, I realized something cruel. Sacrifices mean nothing to people who never saw them as sacrifices in the first place. To Ethan, my hard work was invisible. To Rebecca, my devotion was an obligation. To Richard, my loyalty was a weakness he could exploit. But there was another truth they hadn't counted on. Being a nurse has taught me resilience. I had seen lives crumble in an instant, and I had seen people rebuild from ashes. If I could stand steady in the chaos of an emergency room, I could withstand this betrayal. I left the rehearsal dinner in silence, head held high even as whispers trailed behind me. That night, alone in my small bedroom, I replayed every moment of my past, the long shifts, the tears, the sacrifices that now seemed like wasted currency. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, older, wearier, but not defeated. For the first time in years, I stopped asking why me, and began asking what now. And that question, more than anything, would change everything. From the outside, the Carters looked like a picture of resilience after divorce. 2 children grown into adulthood, a father still polished in public, and a mother who kept her dignity. Neighbors admired the facade. They saw holiday lights, graduation photos, and smiling Christmas cards, but no photograph ever shows the fractures running beneath the surface. Ethan and Rebecca were as different as fire and water. Ethan was born with Richard's confidence and his taste for shortcuts. He never wanted to wait, to save, to earn. He wanted the world to hand him things, and often it did. Richard indulged him with shiny cars, expensive trips, the kind of gifts that bought loyalty. I, on the other hand, was always the one saying, "No, Ethan, earn it first." That single word became the wedge that split us. Rebecca grew up differently. She was softer, more observant. For years, she clung to me, shared secrets, and looked for my approval. But the closer her wedding approached, the more she leaned into her father's orbit. I saw it in her eyes, the desire to keep peace with him, to bask in the approval he offered so easily with money and charm. My daughter, who once begged me to sit front row at her school play, now barely asks my opinion about her wedding dress. And then there was Diana. My daughter-in-law had a smile that could win over strangers, but her sweetness ended at the surface. She was ambitious, always looking for ways to climb higher. In private, her words dripped with venom. "Helen, you've had your time," she once told me while pretending to fold laundry. "This family needs younger voices now." Ethan laughed, and I bit my tongue, unwilling to create a scene. But inside, I felt the sting of being slowly pushed out of my own bloodline. Richard remained the master of appearances. At church, at community gatherings, he was charming, gracious, respected. People whispered about what a devoted father he was, how well his children had turned out. They never saw the distance in our home, the way he used affection as currency, giving more to the child who kept him looking untouchable. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways, no. His cruelty was quieter, smoother. He gave attention like a spotlight, shining bright on one side of the stage, leaving the rest in shadow. For Rebecca, he was the doting father. For Ethan, he was the provider. For me, he was a ghost who appeared when reputation demanded it. I used to think I was imagining things. Maybe I was too sensitive, too tired from years of work to see the truth clearly. But the rehearsal dinner stripped away any illusion. When Rebecca spoke those words, "Mom, you're no longer part of my family," she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was voicing the unspoken agreement they had all signed behind my back. The patterns had been there all along. At birthdays, Ethan's gifts were extravagant. Rebecca's were always the star of the show, while mine were practical, forgotten before the wrapping paper hit the floor. At holidays, Richard toasted to family, but his eyes always lingered on the child who made him proudest that year. And when money troubles surfaced, Ethan's credit card debt, Diana's shopping sprees, it was my savings they turned to, not his. He provided admiration. I provided cash. It became clear that I was never meant to be an equal in their story. I was the safety net, the silent worker behind the curtain, the woman who could be discarded once she stopped being useful. That realization burned. It made me question every smile, every "I love you" I had heard from my children. Were they genuine, or were they rehearsed lines in a play written by Richard's hand? I wanted to believe Rebecca still loved me deep down, that her cruel words at the dinner were born from pressure, manipulation, or Diana's whispers. But the look in her eyes told a different story. It was cold, distant, calculated. She wasn't my little girl anymore. She was Richard's daughter now, molded in his image. And so the cracks in the family portrait became impossible to ignore. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I stopped clinging to hope that things would return to normal. Normal had never really existed. The harmony I longed for had been a lie, painted over the fractures with smiles and photo albums. What remained was truth sharp, brutal, undeniable. And if I had to choose between living in lies or tearing the portrait apart, I knew which path I would take. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I expected to wake up to silence, to shame that would cling like smoke. Instead, I woke up with suspicion burning in my chest. Something about Rebecca's words hadn't felt spontaneous. They were too sharp, too rehearsed, like a script written long before she raised her glass. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at the neat stack of envelopes I had collected over the past year: bills, bank statements, receipts. I had always been careful with money, perhaps too careful. Every cent of my savings, every investment I'd made after Richard left, had been funneled into my children's futures. Yet lately, balances didn't add up. Transfers appeared, but I didn't remember authorizing. My checking account had dipped lower than I could explain. The first real warning came at a bridal boutique 2 weeks earlier. I had offered to pay for the final alteration on Rebecca's gown. When the clerk ran my card, it was declined. My face flushed with embarrassment. "Try again," I said, forcing a smile. It was declined again. Rebecca looked away, cheeks pink, as though the inconvenience was mine alone. Later I called the bank. They told me my account had been temporarily frozen due to unusual activity. Unusual activity. That phrase echoed now as I sifted through the envelopes. There were charges I didn't recognize, luxury stores I never shopped at, restaurant tabs from cities I hadn't visited. Thousands of dollars were drained in the span of weeks. I had brushed it off at the time, blaming technical errors, promising myself I'd call the fraud department when life slowed down. But life never slowed down, and now the evidence was staring back at me in black ink. And then there was Diana. 2 nights before the rehearsal, I had overheard her in the backyard. I had stepped out to water the roses, only to hear her voice drifting through the thin night air, sharp and impatient. "He promised the balance would be cleared before the wedding," she hissed into her phone. I froze by the hose hidden in the dark. "We've got over 50,000 sitting on those cards. If she doesn't pay up, we're ruined." My chest tightened. Was she talking about me? The next morning I confronted Ethan gently. He brushed it off with a laugh, claiming Diana was just venting about student loans. But Ethan couldn't meet my eyes. His smile was forced, his shoulders tense. For the first time, I saw not just a careless son, but a man caught in a web of lies he was too proud to untangle. Now, with the rehearsal humiliation still raw, the pieces began to align. Rebecca's cold words, Ethan's evasions, Diana's late-night whispers, Richard's carefully neutral expression, it all pointed to a plan. They weren't just pushing me aside emotionally, they were cutting me out financially. I opened one envelope after another, my hands trembling. One statement showed a transfer of $10,000 labeled joint expense, except there was no joint account anymore. My name had been used, my signature forged or coerced. Another page revealed cash advances, large ones that I had never requested. The betrayal was written plainly across the pages. I thought back to the dinner, the smirk on Ethan's face, the way Diana leaned in close, as though savoring my downfall. Maybe Rebecca had spoken the words, but someone else had placed them in her mouth. Perhaps she believed I was no longer family, because they had already stripped me of the one thing they valued most, money. I pushed the papers into a folder, my breath shallow. For years I had told myself I was exaggerating their indifference, that if I just gave more, loved harder, they would finally see me. But love had never been the currency they wanted. Still, a nurse's instinct dies hard. We are trained to notice the smallest signs, a flicker in a patient's eye, a tremor in the hand, a pattern of symptoms others overlook. And now that same instinct told me this. What I had uncovered was only the beginning. I tucked the folder under my arm and glanced at the clock. Aunt Linda was due to stop by later that afternoon. She had always seen through Richard's charm, always been the one to warn me that loyalty can turn to blindness. Maybe it was time I stopped hiding my suspicions and shared them with someone who would believe me. For the first time since the rehearsal dinner, the humiliation in my chest shifted into something sharper. Suspicion had a twin, and its name was resolve. They wanted me silent, erased, forgotten. But if they thought I wouldn't fight back, they had forgotten who I was. I had survived 30 years in emergency rooms. I had kept others alive when hope was gone. I could survive this too, and I would find proof every last piece of it. By the time Aunt Linda arrived that afternoon, my dining table was covered in papers, bank statements, receipts, credit card bills, all spread out like pieces of a puzzle. She stepped inside, took one look and said, "Helen, you've finally decided to stop pretending." Her voice carried no judgment, only weary recognition. She had warned me before. I had brushed her off, desperate to believe my children couldn't betray me. But now, I slid the folder across the table. "Look, tell me if I'm crazy." Linda adjusted her glasses and leaned over the papers. Her eyes scanned, her lips pressed tight. "These charges aren't yours," she said flatly. "Luxury handbags? Resort hotels? That's Diana's handwriting on the receipts, not yours. And this," she tapped a transfer marked with my name, "that's forgery." A chill rippled down my spine. Hearing it confirmed by someone else turned suspicion into fact. But there were smaller details too, the kind most people would overlook. On one statement, a payment of exactly $1,249 repeated 3 times, spaced weeks apart. Linda frowned. "Structured withdrawals," she muttered. "Classic way to hide a larger debt." Another receipt revealed a jewelry purchase. I knew Rebecca's taste simple, understated. This was gaudy, expensive, something Diana would flaunt, yet it had been billed to my account. And then came the line that made my stomach drop. Advance wedding deposit, $25,000. Not to the venue Rebecca and Michael had chosen, but to a second venue across town. Linda's eyes narrowed. Why book 2? The realization crept in slowly. My daughter's wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was leverage. Money was moving in circles I hadn't authorized, and my name was the common thread. I thought back to Rebecca's words at the rehearsal dinner. "You're no longer part of my family." Was it her voice or Richard's or Diana's echoing through her? Maybe she believed it. Or maybe she'd been convinced that removing me wasn't just personal, it was practical. Linda reached for my hand. "Helen, this isn't just family tension. They're building something behind your back. And you're footing the bill." The weight of it pressed down, but beneath the weight came clarity. The audience in my life, neighbors, relatives, even strangers who might one day hear my story would understand now. I wasn't a bitter mother clinging to control. I was a woman being robbed, erased, betrayed by those who should have been my protectors. I gathered the papers into the folder again, this time with steadier hands. Proof was forming, one thread at a time. The cracks in the portrait weren't just emotional, they were financial, deliberate, planned, and if I pulled hard enough, the whole picture would tear apart. I should have expected it. Families like mine don't sit quietly when their control is threatened. By the next morning, they had launched their counterattack. It started with a phone call from the bank. My secondary account, one I had barely touched since retirement was suddenly flagged. Someone had attempted a wire transfer of $15,000 in my name. I denied it, of course, but the damage was already done. Questions, suspicions, another hold on my funds. When I asked who initiated the transfer, the representative paused before saying, "Your son, ma'am, Ethan Carter." My chest tightened. He hadn't even tried to hide it. By noon, the whispers had spread further. At the grocery store, 2 women from my neighborhood avoided my eyes, their conversation abruptly silenced as I passed. One finally muttered, "Poor Helen," losing her grip. The words burned. That's when I realized it wasn't just money they were after. They wanted my reputation destroyed. The final blow came on social media. A post appeared in the local community group, written by none other than Diana. Cloaked in the tone of concern, it painted me as unstable. "Please keep my mother-in-law in your prayers," she wrote, attaching a photo of me looking weary outside the rehearsal dinner. "She's been under a lot of stress, and sometimes it shows in erratic ways. We're doing everything we can to support her." Support her. The hypocrisy stung more than the lie. Within an hour, comments poured in sympathy, pity, quiet gossip. People believed it because they wanted to. It fit neatly with the story Ethan and Diana were weaving, the aging mother losing touch, too fragile to handle wedding stress, lashing out at her own children. Richard added his voice in his own subtle way. He called Rebecca that afternoon, loud enough for me to overhear. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he soothed. "Your mother's always been dramatic. This is your day, and we won't let her ruin it." His words were a knife slid between my ribs, clean and precise. By evening, I felt cornered. Money slipping away, my name dragged through whispers and screens, my children standing firmly on the other side of the battlefield. Every instinct screamed to defend myself, to shout the truth. But I held back. Nurses learn early. Sometimes silence in the chaos reveals more than shouting. Because beneath the humiliation, I recognized their fear. If they were working this hard to smear me, it meant they sensed the truth creeping closer. Proof was dangerous to them, and I already had pieces of it tucked away in my folder. They thought they had isolated me. They thought shame would make me retreat. But all they had done was confirm one thing. The fight wasn't just about family anymore. It was about survival. And I wasn't done fighting. The house was quiet that night, but not the comforting quiet of peace. It was the heavy silence of exile. My phone sat on the table, buzzing now and then with messages I didn't dare open. I already knew what they said. Diana's carefully crafted post had spread, and neighbors, cousins, even distant acquaintances were weighing in. Prayers for the family. Hope Helen gets the help she needs. Every word carried the same undertone: pitiful, unstable, irrelevant. I walked from room to room, aimlessly. The photos on my walls felt like accusations: Rebecca in her prom dress, Ethan in his cap and gown, Richard standing behind them with his perfect politician's smile. My image was still there, plastered into the frame, but I looked more like a bystander than a mother. How had I given decades to a family that now treated me like a burden to erase? When the knock came, I nearly ignored it. But then Aunt Linda's voice carried through the door. "Helen, open up. I know you're in there." I let her in, relief and shame warring in my chest. She stepped inside with her usual unhurried grace, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand and something heavier in her eyes. "You haven't eaten, have you?" she asked. "I'm not hungry," I admitted, my voice rough. She set the groceries down, then sat across from me at the kitchen table, folding her hands. For a long moment she simply looked at me. "You know what they're doing, don't you?" "Yes," I whispered. "They want me gone. They want everything: money, reputation, control, and I'm just in the way." Linda nodded slowly. "They've chosen their story, Helen. Now you have to choose yours." Her words puzzled me. "My story? You've been living in theirs for years," she said. "Richard's picture-perfect narrative, Ethan and Diana's entitled demands, Rebecca's need to please the father who always gave her what you couldn't have. You carried the weight so they could shine. But now, they've written you out. If you don't stand up, their story becomes the truth." I felt tears sting my eyes. "But how? Everyone believes them. I'm just one voice." Linda leaned closer, her expression fierce. "One voice is enough, if it's the voice of truth. Look carefully, Helen. The cracks are already showing. People are whispering, not just about you, but about them. Watch where the money goes. Watch who slips. You don't need to expose them yet. Just be ready. When the time comes, you'll have more power than you realize." Her words were cryptic, but they planted a seed. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as I felt. Maybe silence wasn't defeat, it was patience. When she left, the house was still quiet, but the silence felt different. Not empty this time, waiting. And I realized I wasn't completely alone. 2 days after the rehearsal dinner, Aunt Linda asked me to meet her at her house. She lived alone in a modest brick home on the edge of town, far away from the manicured lawns and guarded smiles of the community Richard liked to parade through. Her place smelled faintly of old books and lavender, a kind of comfort I hadn't felt in years. She motioned for me to sit at her dining table. Spread across it was a stack of folders tied together with twine. The paper was yellowed with age, edges curled. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this," she said, her voice low. "But after what they've done, you deserve to know." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Your mother's will," Linda answered. "The original one, the one Richard never wanted you to see." I froze. My mother, Rebecca, and Ethan's grandmother had died years ago. At the time, Richard had handled all the estate matters. He told me there wasn't much left, just some sentimental keepsakes and a modest savings account that barely covered the funeral. I had believed him. Why wouldn't I? Linda slid the first document across the table. "Your mother was careful. She trusted me with a copy just in case. She knew Richard's charm could twist the truth." I scanned the pages, my hands trembling. The words leapt out. "I leave the majority of my estate, including assets totaling $1 million, to my daughter Helen Carter, to be managed at her discretion." I nearly dropped the paper. $1 million. Not just savings, investments, bonds, property, all meant for me. My chest tightened as I realized what that meant. Everything Richard had told me was a lie. Linda's eyes hardened. "He hid it. He wanted you dependent, always scraping, always doubting yourself. So he buried the truth. He convinced you there was nothing, while he pulled the strings and used your sacrifices to keep his reputation clean." I shook my head, disbelief fighting with fury. "But how? There were lawyers. There were papers I signed." "Papers he put in front of you when you were grieving," Linda interrupted. "He counted on your trust. You never questioned because you were too busy holding the family together." I thought of the years I had spent stretching every paycheck, working overtime shifts, and skipping vacations. All that time, the inheritance my mother wanted me to have had been locked away or worse, siphoned by the very man who now stood smugly behind my daughter as she erased me. The betrayal cut deeper than Rebecca's words. It was generational now, a wound passed from my mother's grave to my children's mouths. Linda leaned closer, her voice firm. This isn't just about money. It's about control. They know you're stronger than they want to admit. That's why they've turned Rebecca against you. That's why Diana smears your name. If the truth about this surfaces, their story collapses. Everything they've built, this illusion of you being fragile, unstable, crumbles. I swallowed hard, the weight of it pressing down. And Rebecca? Does she know? Linda hesitated. I don't think so. But Richard, Ethan, Diana, they know enough, and they'll do anything to keep you quiet. A cold clarity settled over me. The money was mine. It had always been mine. My mother had trusted me with her life's work, and I had been robbed. Not by strangers, not by enemies, but by the people who shared my name. I folded the papers carefully, as though they might burn in my hands. Why now, Linda? Why tell me this now? She met my eyes, unwavering. Because you finally stop protecting them. You finally see them for what they are. And because tomorrow, when the guests gather, you'll have a choice. Hide this, or let it shatter the mask they wear. The room felt charged, like the moments before a storm breaks. I thought of the rehearsal dinner, Rebecca's cold eyes, the smirk on Ethan's face, and the pitying glances from neighbors. They believed the story my family had crafted, but they hadn't seen the truth. Not yet. For the first time, the anger inside me shifted into something sharper: resolve. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that I had been betrayed for years. Proof that Richard's charm and my children's contempt were built on lies. Proof that could turn the entire wedding into a reckoning. I looked at Aunt Linda, her steady hands resting on the table, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally found the answer. They thought they erased me, I whispered. But they don't know what's coming. When I left Aunt Linda's house that night, the air felt different against my skin. It wasn't just cool autumn wind brushing past, it was the weight of knowledge settling over me. For years I had walked through life believing I was empty-handed, a woman scraping by while my children and my ex-husband measured my worth in crumbs. Now, the truth was folded in my purse. Proof that my mother had trusted me with her legacy. Proof that Richard had stolen it. Proof that I had never been as powerless as they wanted me to believe. Driving home, memories collided in my mind. Every bill I had worried over. Every time Ethan sneered that I was bad with money. Every time Rebecca looked at Richard with admiration, while treated me like a struggling parent. All of it had been orchestrated. They hadn't just wanted my silence, they wanted my obedience, and for years I gave it to them. I sat at my kitchen table, spreading the papers out like holy scripture, the will, the investment statements, the notarized pages with my name clearly written, bequeathing everything to me. Aunt Linda had even given me photocopies, reminding me to hide them separately in case Richard tried to take them back. My hands shook, not from fear but from the dizzying mix of rage and vindication. It all made sense now. The sudden insistence on my paying for the wedding. The unrelenting pressure to contribute, to keep up appearances. The way Ethan and Diana slipped into my accounts, as though they already belonged to them. They believed I had nothing else to my name. They thought I was too weak, too foolish to notice. And all the while, Richard held the secret close, manipulating the narrative. Helen, the fragile ex-wife. Helen, the aging nurse who had sacrificed too much and saved too little. But I wasn't weak. And I wasn't empty. For the first time, I understood why Rebecca had turned on me so coldly at the rehearsal dinner. Whether she knew about the inheritance or not, Richard had convinced her that I was the obstacle. If she cut me off, she was choosing his favor, his support, his world of money and image. My daughter didn't realize that by casting me out, she was siding with a thief. The betrayal seared, but the anger was stronger. I thought of Diana's smug post online, painting me as unstable. I thought of Ethan's arrogant attempt to steal directly from my account. I thought of Richard's voice at the dinner, smooth as ever, reassuring Rebecca that, "Your mother's always been dramatic." No, this wasn't drama. This was calculated erasure. I gathered the documents into a leather folder, the kind nurses used to carry charts in years ago. Holding it in my arms, I felt steadier. This wasn't just paper, it was a shield, and if needed, it could become a weapon. Still, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. Proof was one thing, timing was another. If I stormed into the wedding ceremony and waved the will around, they'd dismiss me as bitter, unhinged. They'd twist it, accuse me of fabricating it, and claim Aunt Linda had meddled. No, the revelation had to be precise, undeniable, unforgettable. That night I called Linda. "I need more than paper," I said. "I need something they can't spin." Her voice was calm, steady. "You already have it, Helen. The will is ironclad. But if you want the world to believe, you need witnesses, people who can see the truth for themselves." She was right. A room of 200 guests, neighbors, colleagues, church members, people who had always seen Richard as respectable. If they witnessed the truth with their own eyes, no amount of charm or spin could put the mask back on. As I hung up, another thought struck me. The money wasn't even the point. Yes, $1 million could change everything. But what mattered most was the power it gave me, the ability to tear down the lies that had smothered me for decades. I looked at myself in the mirror that night. My reflection was tired, older, but no longer defeated. For the first time in years, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman armed with truth, and truth is heavier than gold. Tomorrow, they would stand in front of their guests, smug in their belief that I was erased. They would expect me to bow out quietly, to let the whispers bury me. But tomorrow, I would no longer play their role. And when the truth was revealed, it wouldn't be me trembling. It would be them. The morning of Rebecca's wedding dawned gray, clouds sagging low as though the sky itself carried the weight of secrets. I woke earlier than usual, not with excitement, but with clarity. My daughter might have cut me from her life, but this day was no longer only hers. It was my stage too, an opportunity to reclaim everything stolen from me. I laid the documents across my bed one last time. The will, the notarized signatures, the account statements show unexplained transfers. Each page was like a piece of shrapnel from a war I hadn't realized I'd been fighting for decades. Aunt Linda had helped me organize them chronologically, making the betrayal impossible to ignore. The story was written right there. My mother's gift to me, Richard's theft, Ethan and Diana's exploitation. But I needed more than paper. I needed a voice that couldn't be silenced. That's where Jason came in. He was the young technician in charge of sound and projection at the wedding venue. I remembered him faintly from community events, quiet, hard-working, with a reputation for honesty. The night before, Aunt Linda had arranged for me to meet him privately in the back of the community hall. Jason's eyes widened when I showed him the folder. "Mrs. Carter, this is serious. If what you're saying is true, people need to know." "They will," I said firmly, "but only at the right time. Can you set up something discreet? A way for me to make sure everyone hears the truth before they can cut me off?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I can rig a backup system. Even if someone tries to shut down the main speakers, I'll have a separate feed ready. All you'll need is a signal." "Good," I told him, the first flicker of confidence warming my chest. "When I nod, you play it." Linda insisted on being by my side. "You won't do this alone," she said, slipping a small flash drive into my hand. "I copied the documents and saved them here. Even if they try to destroy the folder, the truth lives in this." Her presence steadied me. For years I had been the solitary figure in my family, the one holding everything together in silence. Now, I had an ally, someone who believed me without hesitation, someone who knew the Carters' cruelty firsthand. As the morning ticked by, I rehearsed the possibilities. Richard would deny everything, of course. Ethan would scoff. Diana would cry crocodile tears, painting me as hysterical. Rebecca, I didn't know. Maybe she'd crumble, or maybe she'd cling tighter to her father's shadow. But none of it would matter once the truth was undeniable, once 200 witnesses saw the evidence with their own eyes. I slipped into my dress slowly, deliberately. It wasn't new or glamorous. I hadn't been asked to wear matching gowns with the other mothers. But I pinned the folder to the lining of my coat, its weight against my body like armor. Every step I took would carry it with me, a reminder that I was no longer powerless. When I arrived at the venue, the air buzzed with forced excitement. Guests milled about in polished shoes and glittering jewelry, their chatter floating under the chandeliers. Smiles hid curiosity. Curiosity hid judgment. I could feel the whispers about me even before I stepped fully inside. "That's her," someone muttered. "The mother with problems." Let them whisper. Soon, their whispers would turn to gasps. Rebecca avoided my eyes when I passed. Her face was flawless, her dress shimmering under the lights. She looked like the perfect bride, and for a moment, a pang of grief stabbed through me. I wanted to remember her as the little girl clutching my hand at the doctor's office, not the woman declaring me unworthy in public. But grief couldn't hold me now. I caught Richard watching me from across the room, his smile thin, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He knew I wasn't beaten, and for the first time, I enjoyed the flicker of doubt in his gaze. The ceremony would begin in less than an hour. Jason passed me quietly in the hallway, whispering, "Everything's set. Your moment is ready." I nodded, my heart steady, not racing. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting, I was leading. As I returned to the bridal suite, Linda squeezed my hand. "Helen, remember, this isn't just about revenge. It's about truth, about finally freeing yourself." I looked at her and smiled faintly. "The truth will free me," I said, "but it will chain them forever." The time for silence was over. The time for battle had come. The ceremony itself unfolded like a dream at least. The dream my family had been rehearsing for years. The music swelled, the guests sighed at Rebecca's gown, and Richard sat tall in the front row, looking every bit the proud patriarch. I watched from my place, silent and composed, the folder heavy against my coat. Rebecca's vows were beautiful, but they weren't meant for me. Each word floated toward Michael, but I heard the cold echo of her toast from the rehearsal dinner. "You're no longer part of my family." My daughter's smile looked radiant under the stained glass light, but I knew how fragile it really was. When the ceremony ended and the guests poured into the reception hall, the performance continued. Laughter, champagne flutes clinking, the band playing love songs. I stood near the edge of the room, invisible by design. That invisibility had always been their goal until I chose to break it. Jason caught my eye from the sound booth. He gave the smallest nod. Everything was ready. Aunt Linda squeezed my hand. "It's your choice, Helen," she whispered. "Once you do this, there's no going back." "No," I said softly. "There's only forward." When the toasts began, I knew my moment had come. Michael's best man spoke, then Diana raised her glass, her smile dazzling, her words laced with poison. "We are so blessed," she said sweetly, "to have Rebecca joining a family that truly supports her and lifts her up. Some people may not understand what that means, but tonight is about loyalty and love." The implication was sharp, deliberate. I felt the eyes turn toward me. That's when I stood. The room quieted instantly. My voice was calm, steady, the voice I had used countless times in hospital rooms when panic filled the air. "If tonight is about loyalty and love," I said, "then the truth belongs here too." I walked toward the center of the floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's smile froze. Ethan's chair scraped back. Diana's eyes narrowed, her hand gripping Ethan's arm. Rebecca looked stricken, as though she hadn't imagined I would dare. "I was told I'm no longer part of this family," I continued, my eyes sweeping the room. "But if that's true, then you all deserve to know why." I lifted the folder. Jason, watching closely, cued the system, a screen lowered at the far end of the hall, the speakers humming to life. And then, in front of 200 witnesses, the truth began to play. First, the audio. Richard's voice, clipped and cold. "We'll do it quickly. She won't remember much of it anyway." Ethan's laugh is in the background. Diana's whisper, "If she doesn't pay up, we're ruined." And finally, Rebecca's trembling words from the night before. "Mom, you're no longer part of my family." The room erupted in gasps. Neighbors clutched their pearls, guests covered their mouths. The image of perfection shattered in seconds. Then came the documents, projected one by one. My mother's will, the $1 million inheritance left to me, the forged signatures, the suspicious transfers. Jason clicked through each page like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Every detail was undeniable, time-stamped and notarized. "This," I said, holding up the final copy, "is what they didn't want you to see." For years, I believed I was the weak one, the fragile one, the dramatic mother who couldn't measure up. But the truth is simpler. I was their target, and they thought silence would keep me there. Richard surged to his feet. "This is nonsense," he barked, his face red. "She's twisting everything." But Aunt Linda's voice cut through. "No, Richard. I was there. I've kept copies. You lied to your wife, you lied to this family, and now everyone sees it." The hall buzzed with shock. People who had once admired Richard now stared with suspicion. Michael looked at Rebecca, his face pale. "Is this true?" he whispered, but the microphone caught it, amplifying his words for all to hear. Rebecca's lips parted, but no sound came. For once, my daughter's voice failed her. I looked around the room, the eyes of 200 witnesses fixed on me. They wanted me erased. Instead, they erased themselves. The silence that followed was heavier than applause, heavier than any toast. It was the silence of truth settling into every corner of the hall, impossible to undo. And for the first time in decades, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Power. The silence after my revelation lasted only a breath, but in that breath I saw the world tilt. Guests shifted in their seats, their expressions hardening, the golden glow of admiration for Richard and his perfect family dimming into suspicion. Then the whispers began, low at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. "Did you hear that? Forgery? $1 million? She lied?" The words spread across the hall like wildfire, devouring the Carter family's image faster than they could react. Richard, usually a master of control, stumbled over his words. "This is all fabricated. My ex-wife is confused, clearly unstable." But the recording of his own voice still hung in the air, damning and undeniable. "We'll do it quickly. She won't remember much of it anyway." The guests had heard it. No amount of charm could erase it. Ethan jumped to his feet, fists clenched. "You set us up," he shouted across the room, his face flushed, his voice cracking as if the weight of exposure had finally broken his composure. Diana tugged at his arm, hissing for him to sit down, but her eyes darted nervously toward the screen where her own words were displayed. "If she doesn't pay up, we're ruined." Someone in the back of the hall laughed bitterly. "So the Golden family lives off Mom's savings, huh?" More voices joined, not with sympathy but with anger. People had written checks, given gifts, and invested their trust in the Carter name. Now they realized they'd been applauding thieves. Rebecca sat frozen at the bridal table, her hands trembling against the white linen. Michael leaned away from her, his face pale. His parents whispered furiously in his ear, eyes darting between me and the screen. He looked at Rebecca with something worse than anger-disappointment. The tide was turning. Guests began murmuring openly now, no longer concerned with politeness. I knew something was off about Diana. "Did you hear Ethan's laugh in that recording?" Richard Carter, a thief. What a disgrace. The judgment they had once reserved for others now fell squarely on my family's shoulders. Richard slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising above the noise. "Enough. This woman is bitter. She can't stand to see her daughter happy." But Aunt Linda stood, her voice sharp as a whip. "Bitter or honest? You lied about your own mother-in-law's will, Richard. You used Helen's sacrifices to build your reputation while draining her dry. And tonight everyone here saw it." Applause broke out not for me, not for Linda, but for the truth. It started small, then swelled until the hall echoed with the sound. Richard's face turned crimson. Ethan sat back down, jaw clenched, humiliated. Diana buried her face in her hands, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Rebecca whispered something to Michael, desperate, but he shook his head. "You let this happen," he said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You let them destroy your mother. How am I supposed to trust you now?" His words cut deeper than mine ever could. The room shifted again. Pity slipped from Rebecca's allies, replaced by skepticism. Her smile, once radiant, now looked brittle under the harsh lights. As the applause faded, Pastor Harris rose slowly from his seat. His voice carried the weight of decades of authority. "A wedding is meant to celebrate truth and covenant. What we've heard tonight is not the truth, it is betrayal. Betrayal of trust, of family, of God's principles." Gasps followed his words. If the pastor himself condemned them, then the Carter family's reputation was finished. I looked around the room. at the faces of neighbors who had once whispered behind my back. Now they whispered about Richard, Ethan, and Diana. The shame that had weighed on me for years shifted onto their shoulders, heavy and inescapable. And I stood tall, no longer trembling. The Carter name had been built on lies, polished with charm, and sustained by my silence. Tonight, in front of everyone who mattered, I had shattered it. And the sound of it breaking was the sweetest I had ever heard. For years, I had dreamed of what victory might look like. I imagined quiet moments, my children finally saying thank you, Richard admitting he had been wrong, Diana apologizing for her cruelty. But standing in that hall, with 200 eyes fixed on me, and the Carter family crumbling at their own wedding, I realized victory wasn't soft or quiet. It was sharp, electric, undeniable. The applause faded into silence, leaving the weight of judgment heavy in the air. Richard sat stiff, Ethan hunched with his jaw tight, and Diana was blotting her smeared makeup. Rebecca still clung to Michael's hand, but her fiancé's body language spoke volumes. Trust had shattered. I could have walked away right then. I could have let the evidence speak for itself and disappeared into the night, satisfied that their masks had finally slipped. But something in me refused. For 30 years, I had been the silent one, the woman who worked, sacrificed, endured, all while others took the credit. Tonight was not just about exposing lies. Tonight was about reclaiming my voice. I stepped forward again, the folder of documents still in my hand. The room quieted. My voice carried clearly, steady with a strength I hadn't felt in years. For decades, I believed love meant sacrifice, I began. I gave my time, my money, my health. I told myself that if I just gave more, they would finally see me. But tonight you all witnessed the truth. Every sacrifice I made was taken, twisted, and used against me. I looked at Ethan and Diana. You drained my accounts, smeared my name, and laughed while doing it. I turned to Richard. You buried my mother's will and kept me scraping while you built your empire of lies. Finally, I let my eyes rest on Rebecca, my voice softening but not breaking. And you, my daughter, you let their poison convince you that I was your enemy. You erased me before the ink of your vows was even dry. Gasps rose from the guests, but I continued. But I am not erased. I am not fragile. I am not the woman they painted me to be. I am stronger than every lie they told, and I will never again be the victim of their story. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Heads nodded. Neighbors who once pitied me now looked at me with respect. For the first time in years, I felt taller than Richard's practiced smile, taller than Ethan's arrogance, taller than Diana's venom. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't waver. Her pain no longer held me hostage. My voice rose, clear and final. This ends tonight. I will not pay your debts. I will not be your scapegoat, and I will not disappear. From this moment forward, I live for myself. The applause came again, stronger this time, echoing against the walls of the hall. It wasn't polite clapping. It was fierce, cathartic, a chorus of witnesses who had seen the truth and chosen to honor it. Richard tried to stand, to reclaim control, but no one listened. The pastor avoided his gaze. Michael's parents turned their backs. Even Rebecca couldn't defend him. The power he had wielded for so long slipped from his hands, scattering like dust. And in its place, I felt something settle inside me, something I hadn't known I was missing: dignity. For years, I had bent under the weight of sacrifice, believing it was love. Now, I understand. Love without respect is slavery. Tonight, I broke those chains. I stood in the center of the room, not as the discarded mother, not as the bitter ex-wife, but as a woman reborn. And as I met the eyes of the guests, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers, I knew they weren't just seeing me. They were seeing the truth. I had been invisible for so long, but tonight I was undeniable. The reception carried on, but the energy had shifted. The chandeliers still glowed, the band still played, but laughter had drained from the room like water from a cracked vase. Guests lingered, whispering in corners, sneaking glances at Richard, Ethan, and Diana. Their once shining reputation had collapsed in front of their peers, and no amount of forced smiles could patch it back together. I stood near the doorway, no longer trying to fade into the background. For the first time in years, I didn't need to. People approached me cautiously, neighbors who once ignored me, women from church who had whispered behind my back. They touched my arm, their words hushed but earnest. "I had no idea, Helen. You were so strong tonight. If I'd known, I would have spoken sooner." Their support felt good, but I didn't need their validation anymore. My dignity wasn't borrowed from others, it was mine, reclaimed. Rebecca avoided me most of the night, sitting stiff beside Michael. I caught her glancing at me once, her expression torn between anger and shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Michael's parents ushered him away, leaving her alone at the bridal table. My heart ached, but I reminded myself, pity isn't love. I couldn't keep bleeding for a daughter who chose to wound me to protect lies. Ethan and Diana tried to slip out quietly, but whispers followed them like shadows. Someone muttered, 50,000 in debt and stealing from their mother shameful. Diana's face flushed red. Ethan kept his eyes on the ground. The golden couple was golden no longer. Richard, however, stayed. He lingered near the bar, his jaw tight, his drink untouched. I approached him one last time. He straightened, forcing the old charm onto his face. "Helen, you've embarrassed us all. Are you satisfied?" I looked him in the eye, steady and unflinching. "Satisfied?" "No, Richard. I'm free." "There's a difference," he scoffed. "You think you've won? You destroyed Rebecca's wedding and humiliated your children. You've burned every bridge." I leaned closer, my voice low. "No, you destroyed them when you buried my mother's will. When you lied to me. When you raised children to believe money mattered more than love. I didn't burn bridges. I walked away from the ashes you created." His mask slipped, just for a moment. I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The man who had thrived on image now had none left to hide behind. He turned away, shoulders heavy, and for the first time I realized Richard Carter wasn't powerful. He was pitiful. By the end of the night, I had made my decision. I wouldn't keep the house that had been filled with secrets and sacrifices. I would sell it, take the inheritance that was rightfully mine, and carve out a new life where no one could touch me. The thought didn't make me sad, it made me lighter, freer. When the last guests trickled out, I walked outside into the cool night air. The sky had cleared, stars glittering sharp and bright. Aunt Linda joined me, her hand warm on my arm. "You did it, Helen," she said. "No," I whispered, looking back at the hall where my family sat fractured. "They did it to themselves. I just stopped protecting them from the truth." Linda smiled, her eyes proud. "So what now?" I breathed deeply, the night air filling my lungs. Now I begin again, on my own terms. For years, my life had been defined by sacrifice, by what I gave up, by who I served, by the love I kept trying to earn. Tonight, I chose differently. I chose myself. And as I walked away from the glowing hall, the voices of the past still echoing behind me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never again let them write my story. The days after, the wedding felt strangely quiet. No more rehearsals, no frantic phone calls, no family members circling me like vultures. For the first time in decades, I had silence that belonged to me, and it wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was freedom. I sold the house within weeks. The rooms that had once echoed with my sacrifices, with my children's demands and Richard's commands, were boxed up and emptied. Each step through those halls was like shedding another layer of weight. I didn't feel grief. I felt release. That house had never really been mine, it had been their stage. Leaving it behind felt like stepping out of costume and into my own skin. The inheritance my mother had left me was finally secure, no longer hidden under Richard's lies. $1 million wasn't just money. It was proof that I had been trusted, that my mother had seen my worth long before anyone else tried to erase it. I invested part of it, donated some to causes close to my heart, and kept enough to build a modest new life. For once, I wasn't scraping by. For once, I didn't have to beg for dignity. Rebecca reached out once, weeks later. Her message was hesitant. "Mom, can we talk?" I stared at the words, my heart twisting. A part of me wanted to run back, to hold her, to forgive her instantly. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I knew she needed time to reckon with her choices, to see the damage she had done. So I didn't answer, not yet. Some wounds need silence before they can heal. Ethan never called. Diana never apologized. Richard avoided me in public, his once practiced smile now brittle. In the eyes of the community, they were no longer the perfect Carter family. They were the cautionary tale, whispered about in grocery aisles and church pews. And me? I wasn't the fragile mother they tried to paint me as. I was a survivor. The lesson carved into me that night was one I want the world to hear. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by truth, respect, and loyalty. Sometimes, the people closest to you can betray you the deepest. But betrayal doesn't have to break you. It can sharpen you. It can set you free. I spent too many years believing sacrifice was love. I know better now. Real love doesn't demand your silence. It doesn't drain you dry. Real love builds you up. And if you don't find that love within your family, you can still create it elsewhere with friends, with allies, even within yourself. As I settled into my new home, a small, sunlit place filled with books and flowers, I realized something important. The story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, my strength, my dignity, my freedom. To anyone listening, anyone who has ever felt erased, manipulated, or silenced by the people who should have protected you, I say this: you are not alone. Your story doesn't end with their betrayal. It begins with your truth. And maybe, just maybe, when you choose yourself, you'll find what I found: peace. So I ask you, dear listener, dear viewer, dear witness, what would you do if your own family turned against you? Would you stay silent, or would you rise? Because in the end, the most powerful revenge isn't screaming back. It's standing tall, speaking the truth, and living free. And if my story has reached you tonight, if it's made you think, made you feel, made you remember your own strength, then don't let it stop here. Share your story. Leave a comment. Let others know they aren't alone. And above all, subscribe. Because there are more stories like mine waiting to be told, and maybe the next one will be the one that gives you the courage to finally rise.